The night was not silent when Thor came into the world. The skies above Asgard split with fury, lightning searing the heavens in jagged streaks, as if the very fabric of the cosmos trembled at his arrival. The golden halls of Gladsheim shook, and the gods turned their eyes toward the storm, knowing that something mighty had been born. Jane, the earth herself, bore him a son of strength, of wrath, of untamed power. Odin Allfather, his sire, stood over the child, his single eye burning with pride and prophecy. The babe did not wail like mortal children, he roared, his tiny fists clenched, veins pulsing with the raw might of storms yet to come. From the first breath, Thor was violence given flesh. His cries shook the mountains. His laughter sent tremors through the roots of Yggdrasil. He took Thor to the training grounds where the boy learned to break bones before he learned mercy. The Allfather's lessons were brutal sword strokes that split oak, spear throws that pierced stone. Thor bled often, but his wounds only fed his rage, his body healing faster than any mortals could. The Aesir watched as he grew not in years, but in fury. At 3 winters old, he shattered a table with a single strike of his palm. At 5, he wrestled a bear and broke its spine with his bare hands. Blood splattered his golden hair, his blue eyes alight with the thrill of battle. Even then, Odin saw the fire in his son and knew it must be honed. One evening, as the sun drowned in crimson, Odin led him to the edge of Asgard, where the Bifrost burned with celestial fire. "You are not merely a warrior," the Allfather said, his voice like grinding stone. "You are the storm, and storms do not ask for permission to rage." Thor clenched his fists, knuckles white, lightning flickering between his fingers. The air smelled of ozone and iron. He understood then his destiny was written in thunder, in the screams of his enemies, in the blood that would one day drown the world. And so, the god of war was forged. The forges of Svartalfheim burned with a hunger no mortal flame could match. Rivers of molten metal snaked through the caverns, hissing like serpents as dwarven hands gnarled and soot-blackened shaped the bones of the earth into weapons fit for gods. Brokkr and Sindri, the greatest smiths among their kind, had been summoned by Loki's silver tongue and Odin's unspoken threat. The task was simple, yet impossible. Craft a weapon mighty enough to match the storm that lived in Thor's veins. The dwarves worked without rest, their hammers rising and falling in a rhythm older than time. It was Brutala, head of dark iron, its surface etched with runes that burned when touched. The dwarves presented Mjolnir with trembling hands, knowing the storm god's temper was as unpredictable as the weapon itself. The handle was too short, a flaw born of Loki's interference, yet it mattered not. The weapon pulsed with a life of its own, thirsting for war. The first strike cracked the anvil. The second split the stone beneath their feet. The hammer was more than a weapon. It was an extension of Thor's wrath, a tool that would crack the skulls of giants and drown the realms in blood. The third drew blood Brokkr's own, dripping into the molten core of the weapon, binding it with the fury of the forge. Lightning tore through the cavern roof, searing the air with the scent of ozone and charred flesh. The blow crushed the Jtun's chest, ribs exploding outward in a spray of frozen blood. Thor grinned as the corpse hit the earth, the hammer already hungry for more. The hammer roared in his grip, trembling with power as if recognizing its master. The metal screamed as it was folded, tempered and quenched in the venom of the world serpent, stolen in the dead of night. When the hammer at last took shape, it was not beautiful. Thor was called to Svartalfheim to claim his birthright. He strode into the smoke-choked cavern, his muscles tensed, his eyes alight with the promise of destruction. The moment Thor's fingers closed around the handle, the sky above the forge shattered. Loki, who had watched with a smirk, now clutched the walls to keep from being swept away. Only Thor stood unmoved, his laughter booming like thunder, his weapon humming with the promise of slaughter. He swung at once. The shockwave flattened the surrounding mountains. Brokk and Sindri were thrown back, their bones rattling, their ears bleeding. Odin watched from the shadows, his single eye gleaming. And so, Mjolnir was born, not just a hammer, but the herald of the storm. The first death it claimed was that of a frost giant who dared challenge Thor before the forge's embers had even cooled. This was only the beginning. The weight of Mjolnir in Thor's grip was a promise one written in blood and soon to be fulfilled. Odin had no patience for untested strength. God who could not conquer his own rage was no god at all, but a beast. Thor's first trial came in the form of the Draug, the unquiet dead that clawed their way from barrows with flesh still rotting from their bones. They came at him under a moonless sky, their hollow eyes glowing with malice, their jagged teeth gnashing. Mjolnir sang as it crushed the first revenant's skull, blackened marrow spraying across the grass. The others fell upon him like wolves, but Thor was no prey. His hammer swung in arcs of destruction, shattering rib cages, pulverizing limbs, till the earth was slick with the remnants of the dead. But Odin was not satisfied. And so the Allfather cast his son into the wilds beyond Asgard's golden gates, where the land itself was a battlefield. Next came the Troll of the Ironwood, a beast whose hide was tougher than forged steel. Its claws could rend the soul from a man's body. It ambushed Thor at dusk, its massive form blotting out the dying sun. The first blow from Mjolnir cracked the creature's jaw, but it did not fall. It roared, spitting teeth and black bile, and lashed out. Claws raked Thor's chest, painting his tunic crimson. The pain only enraged him. He seized the troll by its throat and drove it into the earth, hammer rising and falling until the beast's skull was little more than pulp beneath his boots. But his eyes burned with the knowledge of his own strength. Still, Odin watched. Still, he demanded more. The final trial was not of flesh, but of will. Deep in the heart of Niflheim, where the cold was a living thing that gnawed at bone. Thor stood alone against the Frostfang, a monstrous wolf whose breath turned blood to ice. Its fangs dripped venom that could paralyze even a god. The battle was not swift. Beast was cunning, its movements a blur of white fur and snapping jaws. It tore into Thor's arm, freezing the flesh black. He roared, not in pain, but in defiance. With his free hand, he seized the wolf's lower jaw and wrenched it apart. Bone splintered, sinew snapped. The creature's howl became a gurgle as Thor buried Mjolnir in its skull, the impact shaking the frozen earth. Lightning coursed through his veins, his muscles swelling with divine fury. When he returned to Asgard, his body was a tapestry of wounds, his armor in ruins. Odin met him at the gates, his face unreadable. Thor had passed the trials. Without a word, Odin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a rare gesture of approval. But war was only beginning. The message arrived carved into the skull of an Aesir warrior, delivered by a wind that stank of frost and rotting meat. Thor Odinson, come and die. The words were etched in runes of frozen blood, the work of Ragnar, mightiest of the Jitnir. The giant had declared war not just on Thor, but on all of Asgard. The giant stood 3 times Thor's height, his body hewn from living stone, his heart a slab of granite that pulsed with ancient malice. In one hand, he clutched a whetstone the size of a shield, its edges sharp enough to split the sky. In the other, a club carved from the spine of a mountain. His challenge was a spear thrown at the feet of the gods, and Thor's hands itched to answer it. He found Ragnar on the plains of Vigrid, where the earth was already trembling with the promise of slaughter. Thor did not hesitate. Mjolnir left his grip before his boots touched the ground, a streak of death hurtling toward the giant's chest. Ragnar barely raised his whetstone in time, as the impact shattered it into 1,000 razored shards, each one slicing through flesh and stone alike. The giant roared, black blood gushing from 100 wounds, but he did not fall. Instead, he swung his club in a blow that would have flattened a hall. Thor leapt on away, but into the strike. Bone met divine flesh. Ribs cracked. Blood sprayed from Thor's lips, but his fingers found the giant's throat. Lightning erupted from his skin, searing through Ragnar's stone hide, turning it molten. The giant bellowed, his club falling forgotten as he clawed at the god, clinging to him like a wolf to a stag's flank. Thor's free hand summoned Mjolnir back to his grip. The first blow shattered Ragnar's knee. The second caved in his chest. The third struck the giant's skull with the force of a falling star. Stone exploded. Brains and shards of rock rained down upon the battlefield. This was his purpose. This was his joy. Ragnar's corpse toppled like a felled oak, shaking the earth as it fell, but the battle was not yet over. The giant's legs, still twitching with residual life, collapsed forward straight toward Thor. A lesser god would have been crushed. Thor braced, muscles straining as he caught the dead weight of the falling limbs, his boots sinking into the earth under the force. Veins bulged along his arms, his teeth grinding with effort, but he did not yield. With a roar that shook the clouds, he hurled the massive limbs aside, where they landed with a crash that sent tremors through Jotunheim itself. Silence followed, then laughter. Thor stood amidst the ruin of his enemy, his body painted in blood both red and black, his chest heaving, not with exhaustion but with exhilaration. From the shadows of a nearby crag, Loki watched, his grin sharp as a dagger. The first giant had fallen, but the war had only just begun. The feast in Asgard's great hall should have been a celebration. Ragnar's shattered corpse still lay cooling on the plains of Vigrid, and the mead flowed like rivers of gold. But where the Aesir saw victory, Loki saw opportunity. He watched from the shadows, his emerald eyes glinting with mischief. As Thor roared with laughter, his massive hands stained with dried blood. The thunder god had grown reckless in his triumph, his pride swollen like a storm cloud. Loki's lips curled into a knife's-edge smile. Pride was always the easiest weakness to exploit. The trick began with whispers. Loki slipped into the company of the giants as easily as a serpent into tall grass. To Thrym, king of the Jitnir, he spoke of Thor's arrogance. To the frost giants, he murmured of Asgard's complacency. And to the fire giants of Muspelheim, he painted visions of Mjolnir's power lying unguarded, ripe for the taking. The trap was set before the first star had faded from the dawn sky. Thor awoke to find his hammer gone. The empty space where Mjolnir should have rested screamed louder than any battle cry. His fingers twitched, phantom weight aching in his palm. The air itself seemed to recoil from the god's rising fury, the very stones of Asgard trembling under his wrath. Loki found him amidst the wreckage of his chambers, furniture reduced to splinters, walls cracked from the force of Thor's rage. "It was Thrym," Loki said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The giant king has taken Mjolnir, demands Freya as his bride in exchange for its return." Thor's roar shook the heavens. Lightning arced from his clenched fists, searing the marble floors. It would tear Thrym's kingdom apart. Stone by stone, would paint the snow red with giant blood. But Loki raised a hand. Or, he murmured, "We could be clever." The plan was absurd, humiliating. Thor would wear the bridal gown instead. The disguise was flawless Freya's golden necklace at his throat, the scented veil hiding his beard, the heavy skirts disguising the deadly weight of Mjolnir hidden beneath layers of silk. Loki, playing the part of the bride's handmaiden, could barely contain his laughter as they rode into Jotunheim. Thrym's hall stank of roasting meat and unwashed flesh. The giant king leered at his bride, his yellowed teeth glinting in the firelight. Thor's fingers itched for his hammer, but he forced himself to wait, to endure the giant's clammy hands on his own, the lecherous whispers in his ear. When the feast was at its height, and Thrym drunkenly ordered Mjolnir, brought forth to bless the union, Thor's patience snapped. The hammer flew to his hand like a starving wolf to meat. The first blow caved in Thrym's skull, spraying bone and brain across the high table. The second shattered the spine of the nearest giant. By the third strike, the hall was a charnel house, bodies piling like cordwood. Blood sluicing across the floor in thick, steaming rivers. Loki watched from the rafters, his laughter lost in the screams. Thor's vengeance was a storm given form, relentless, indiscriminate. When the last giant fell, his chest heaving, his borrowed gown in tatters, he turned his glare on Loki. The trickster merely grinned and raised a goblet of stolen mead in salute. Mjolnir was reclaimed, but the game was far from over. The Bifrost's light faded behind them, leaving Thor and Loki standing at the edge of a frozen wasteland where the wind carried. The stench of rotting meat and ancient grudges. Jotunheim stretched before them, a realm of jagged ice mountains and bottomless crevasses, where the bones of forgotten gods lay half buried in the snow. Thor's fingers tightened around Mjolnir's handle, the leather grip creaking under his grip. The hammer still smelled of Thrym's blood, and it hungered for more. Loki, wrapped in furs that shimmered like shifting shadows, flashed a grin that held too many teeth. "Try not to start a war before we find what we came for, brother." Thor ignored him, Its eyes were fixed on the distant peaks, where the frost giant's stronghold loomed like a broken tooth against the iron-gray sky. Odin had sent them to retrieve the stolen mead of poetry, a draft brewed from the blood of a murdered god. But Thor cared little for poetry only, for the blood that would spill when he reached those who had dared to steal from Asgard. The first attack came at dusk. A hunting party of Gitner, their blue-white hides mottled with scars, burst from the ice like wolves from a den. Their leader, a brute with tusks jutting from his lower jaw, swung a cleaver forged from a dead giant's rib. Mjolnir met the blade mid-swing. The cleaver exploded into shrapnel, embedding itself in the faces of two oncoming giants. Thor's follow-up strike caved in the leader's chest, ribs splintering inward to pierce the heart beneath. Frost giant blood, thick and black as tar, sprayed across the snow. Loki danced at the edges of the fray, his daggers finding throats and eyes, his laughter as sharp as the blades themselves. But the giants kept coming. By the time the last one fell, the snow was a slaughterhouse. Thor stood panting amidst the carnage, steam rising from his blood-soaked arms. The mead of poetry was still miles away, and every corpse at his feet was a beacon calling more enemies to their location. Loki wiped his dagger clean on a dead giant's fur. "We should move, unless you'd like to fight the entire realm before sunrise?" Thor grunted, hefting Mjolnir onto his shoulder. The journey grew darker with every step. Glowing eyes watched from ice caves. The wind carried whispers in a language older than Asgard. Once the ground itself trembled not from Thor's power, but from something far beneath the permafrost, something vast and hungry. Then, at the mouth of a cavern lined with frozen corpses, they found their quarry. The giant Suttungr guarded the mead, his massive form blocking the entrance, his single eye burning with malice. "Turn back, little gods," he rumbled, "or join the statues outside." Thor's answer was a lightning-charged swing of Mjolnir. The battle that followed shook the mountains. When it was over, the mead was theirs. But Jotunheim would not forget this insult, neither would Thor. The sea knew what was coming. Waves heaved like dying beasts as Thor's fishing boat cut through the black waters, the hull groaning under the weight of his purpose. The ox head, freshly hacked from its carcass, dripped gore onto the deck, its stench thick enough to drown the salt air. Loki lounged against the mast, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the wood. "This is madness," he murmured, though his grin said otherwise. Thor ignored him. His hands, still flecked with blood from the slaughter in Threem's Hall, worked the rope with brutal efficiency. The hook, forged from iron as thick as a man's wrist, gleamed wickedly in the fading light. He impaled the ox head with a wet crunch, then hurled the bait into the depths. The water stilled. A heartbeat passed. Then the line snapped taut with enough force to crack the gunwale. The boat lurched, nearly capsizing, as something monstrous took the bait. Thor's muscles strained, veins bulging along his arms as he hauled back. The rope bit into his palms, drawing blood that sizzled where it struck the sea. The ocean itself seemed to recoil, waves parting as the thing beneath the surface fought to drag them under. Then the sea erupted. Jormungandr's head broke the surface in a storm of foam and fury, his emerald scales glistening with venom, his fangs longer than a man's leg. The ox head was nothing but splinters between his teeth. The serpent's eyes, vast and pitiless as the abyss, locked onto Thor. Recognition flared. Mjolnir was already in the air. The hammer struck true, cracking against the beast's skull with a sound like a mountain splitting. Jormungandr screamed, his coils thrashing, his blood black and corrosive raining down upon the waves. The boat shattered under the force of his agony, planks exploding into kindling. Thor fell into the sea, still gripping the rope, still pulling. The water burned where the serpent's blood touched it. Thor's skin blistered, his beard smoking, but his grip never faltered. Lightning arced from his free hand, searing into the beast's flesh, charring scales to ash. Jormungandr twisted, his gargantuan body coiling around Thor, crushing the breath from his lungs. Bones creaked. Blood filled Thor's mouth. And still, he laughed. Mjolnir returned to his fist, as the next blow tore out one of the serpent's eyes. The sea turned black with ichor. Somewhere above, Loki watched from the splintered remains of the mast, his laughter lost in the thunder. The serpent's death throes would be remembered in the sagas. But this was not the end. was only the beginning. The gates of Utgargar loomed before them, towering and grotesque, carved from the bones of long-dead beasts. The air here was thick with the stench of old magic and older deceit. Thor's knuckles whitened around Mjolnir's haft, his skin still raw from the serpent's venom, his blood still singing with the memory of battle. Loki strode beside him, his smirk a blade in the half-light. "Mind your temper, Thunderer," he murmured. "Not all battles are won with hammers." Thor said nothing. The scars along his arms ached in warning. The hall's doors groaned open on their own, revealing a feast of nightmares. Giants lounged on benches of yellowed bone, their laughter like grinding stone. At the high table sat Utgarkaloki, his form shifting like smoke, his grin too wide for any true face. "So the mighty Thor graces us," the giant king boomed, his voice slithering between tones. "Let us see if his strength matches his reputation." The first challenge was a drinking horn, its rim crusted with the dried froth of centuries. "Drain it in one draught," Utgarkaloki commanded, "if you can." Thor raised the horn to his lips and drank. The mead burned like poison, searing his throat, yet the vessel never emptied. 3 times he drank, until his veins bulged and his vision swam, yet the horn remained nearly full. The giants roared with laughter, their spittle flecking his face. The second challenge was a catabeast the size of a mountain, its fur matted with the blood of failed challengers. "Lift it," the giant king sneered. Thor's muscles strained, his tendons screaming as he heaved. The cat's claws shredded the earth, yet its belly never left the ground. Only a single paw rose, trembling, before the creature hissed and settled back into place. The hall shook with mocking cheers. The third challenge was an old woman. "Wrestle her," Utgarkaloki demanded, "and prove your might." Thor grasped her withered arms and met resistance like the roots of Yggdrasil itself. The crone's fingers dug into his flesh, drawing blood as she forced him to one knee. The giants howled, their taunts a living thing, crawling into his ears like maggots. Only when the dawn light bled through the high windows did the truth reveal itself. The horn had been tied to the sea itself. The cat was Jarmangander in disguise, the crone old age incarnate whom none could best. Utgarkaloki's laughter peeled the flesh from his bones, revealing the trickster god beneath. "You fought well," Loki said, his true face emerging like a knife from a sheath against illusions. Thor's roar shook the hall's foundations, Mjolnir arced through the air and struck nothing. The hall, the giants, all melted like frost in the sun. Only Loki remained, his grin a wound in the world. The battle was lost before it began, but the war was far from over. The dreams began as whispers. Thor awoke in the dead of night, his chest heaving, his skin slick with sweat that smelled of ozone and iron. The visions clung to him like cobwebs, flashes of a sun swallowed by wolves, of oceans boiling under a blackened sky, of a serpent so vast its coils encircled the world. He rose from his bed, his fingers twitching toward Mjolnir's familiar weight. The hammer pulsed in response, its runes glowing faintly in the dark, as if it too sensed what was coming. The halls of Asgard stood silent around him, but the silence was wrong. It was the quiet of a tomb, of a battlefield before the first blow is struck. Even the stars seemed dimmer tonight, their light bleeding away into some unseen void. Thor stepped out into the cold air, his breath fogging before him. The courtyard should have been empty. It was not. Odin stood at the edge of the observatory, his single eye fixed on the horizon. His ravens, Hugin and Mjolnir, perched on his shoulders like shadows given form. The Allfather did not turn as Thor approached, but his grip on Gundyr tightened the slightest tremor in his fingers, betraying what his face did not. "You've seen it," Odin said, his voice like stone grinding against stone. Thor did not answer. He did not need to. The wind carried the scent of ash. Far below in the bowels of Asgard, the roots of Yggdrasil trembled. The great trees' leaves, normally a tapestry of shimmering green, had begun to blacken at the edges, curling in on themselves like dying hands. The well of Jord, where the Norns wove the fates of gods and men alike, it turned murky, its waters thick with something darker than blood. Thor's jaw clenched. He had faced giants, monsters, the very fabric of deception itself, but this was a shadow no hammer could shatter. A scream shattered the stillness. Thor moved before the sound had faded, Mjolnir's chain whipping through the air as he launched himself toward the source. He found the sentry at the western gate, or what was left of him. The man's body had been torn open from throat to groin, his armor split like parchment, his entrails steaming in the frost. Above him, carved into the stone in strokes too precise to be mortal, was a single rune: Thuris's, the Thorn, the Destroyer, the mark of the end. Thor's roar shook the heavens. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the distant mountains where shapes too large to be natural now stirred. The giants were coming, and with them, the twilight of the gods. The first snow fell black. It drifted from the sky like ash, clinging to the golden roofs of Asgard, staining the banners of the gods with its touch. Thor stood in the silent courtyard, his breath fogging in the unnatural chill, his fingers flexing around Mjolnir's handle. The hammer felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of what was coming had already begun to press down upon it. A scream tore through the stillness. Thor moved before the sound had faded, his boots pounding against the stone as he raced toward the great hall. The doors loomed before him, carved with scenes of battles long past, but now they stood ajar, their edges splintered as if something had forced its way through. Inside, the air reeked of iron and something darker. Baldur lay sprawled across the feasting table, his golden hair fanned out beneath him like a shattered halo. The mistletoe shaft protruded from his chest, its tip buried deep in his heart, the wood already blackening with venom. His blood, bright as sunlight, pooled beneath him, dripping onto the floor in steady, rhythmic drops. Frigg knelt beside him, her hands pressed to the wound, her lips moving in silent, desperate prayer. But even her magic could not undo what had been done. Baldur's eyes, once so full of light, stared unseeing at the ceiling, their brilliance fading like embers in the rain. Thor's throat tightened. His grip on Mjolnir turned his knuckles white. Loki was gone. Vanished like smoke, leaving only laughter in his wake. But the gods did not need to hunt him. Thor's roar shook the hall, the sound raw with grief and fury. Lightning arced from his fists, searing the walls, the tables, the very air itself. The other Aesir recoiled, their faces pale, their voices hushed. None dared to speak, none dared to move. Odin stood apart, his single eye burning with a fire that had nothing to do with rage. His fingers curled around Gundier, the spear trembling in his grasp. The Allfather did not weep, did not scream, but the silence in his gaze was worse. Thor turned on his heel, his cloak whipping behind him as he strode from the hall. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the black flakes melting where they touched his skin, leaving streaks like tears. Baldur was gone, and with him the last light before the end. Now the shadows stretched longer now, creeping across Asgard like a stain. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a sound too deep to knowing to be anything but an omen. Thor did not look back. There was only one thing left to do: kill. The ship waited, its hull blackened by prophecy, its sails tattered with the breath of the dead. Nagelfa, the vessel of nails, creaked in the frozen harbor, its deck crowded with the silent shades of those long fallen. They did not speak, they did not need to. Their hollow eyes said enough. Thor stood at the shore, the sea foam licking at his boots like a starving dog. The weight of Mjolnir hung heavy at his side, its runes dulled by ash and time. Behind him, and Reskva stood ready, their faces grim, their hands clenched around weapons that would mean nothing when the end came. They all knew, and this was the last journey. The sky above was a wound, bleeding crimson and black. The air stank of burning worlds, of gods yet to die. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the great wolf Fenrir howled, his chains straining, his jaws already wet with anticipation. Thor stepped onto the ship. The wood groaned beneath his weight, the sound like bones breaking. Shades parted before him, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed ahead, on the roiling darkness where the sea met the sky. And Reskva followed, their footsteps silent. They had stood by him through storms and slaughter, through blood and betrayal. They would stand by him now, even as the world crumbled around them. The ship moved without wind, without oars. It cut through the black waters like a knife through flesh, leaving a trail of froth that hissed and spat as it faded. The waves grew taller, their crests sharp as blades, their depths hiding things that slithered and watched. Thor's fingers tightened around Mjolnir. The hammer trembled, not with fear, but with hunger. It too knew what was coming. A shadow moved beneath the waves, something vast, something coiled, Jormungandr. The serpent had grown since their last meeting. His scales were the color of drowned corpses, his eyes like pits into the abyss. He did not surface, not yet, but his presence thick in the air made the ship's timbers shudder. Thor did not smile, he bared his teeth. The shore faded behind them. The cries of the dying, the screams of the betrayed, the last prayers of the doomed all, of it melted into the thunder that now rolled across the sky. The final battle waited. And Thor would meet it with blood on his hands and lightning in his veins. The sea boiled. Great geysers of black water erupted around Naglfar as Jormungandr rose from the depths, his scaled body thicker than ancient oaks, his maw wide enough to swallow the ship whole. Venom dripped from his fangs, hissing where it struck the waves, turning the ocean to poison. His eyes, twin pits of primordial malice, fixed on Thor. The thunder god stood at the prow, Mjolnir crackling in his grip, lightning dancing along his arms. The serpent had grown since their last battle. His coils now bore scars from their previous encounters, his hide thickened with centuries of hatred. Thor did not wait. With a roar that shook the crumbling heavens, he leaped from the ship. Mjolnir raised high. The hammer struck the serpent's skull with the force of a falling star, scales shattering like brittle stone. Jormungandr screamed, his tail whipping the sea into a frenzy, waves crashing against the ship hard enough to splinter the hull. And Raisfa clung to the mast, their weapons useless against such a beast. This was not their fight, it had always been Thor's. The serpent struck like a whip, his fangs sinking into Thor's shoulder, venom burning through flesh and muscle like acid. Thor bellowed, not in pain, but in fury. His free hand seized the beast's lower jaw, fingers digging into the soft flesh beneath the scales. Lightning erupted from his skin, charring the serpent's maw from within, the stench of burning meat thick in the air. Mjolnir rose again, and fell, again and again. Each strike split scales, shattered bone, sent black blood, geysering into the storm-racked sky. The serpent's coils lashed, crushing Thor's ribs, squeezing until his armor buckled, and his breath came in ragged, bloody gasps. Still, the hammer fell. The final blow caved in the serpent's skull. Jormungandr's death throes sent tidal waves across the drowning world. His body spasmed, his tail smashing Naglfar into kindling, his venom flooding the sea. Thor staggered back, his body failing, his vision darkening at the edges. 9 steps. That was all he managed before the poison reached his heart. He fell to his knees, Mjolnir slipping from his fingers, the hammer's glow fading like the last ember of a dying fire. The sky wept blood-red rain as the thunder god's breaths grew shallow. Somewhere beyond the ruin of the world, the wolf howled, and Thor smiled. He had kept his promise. The serpent was dead. Now came the long dark. The world burned. Ash fell like snow upon the corpse-strewn battlefield, where gods and monsters lay tangled in death's final embrace. The great serpent's carcass rotted in the poisoned sea, his coils slack, his fangs still dripping venom into the blackened waves. Nearby, Thor's body lay half-submerged in the bloodied shallows, his fingers curled around Mjolnir's handle, his face frozen in a warrior's grimace. The storm had died with him. But thunder does not fade so easily. As the last embers of Ragnarok cooled, as the survivors crawled from the wreckage of the 9 realms, whispers began. In the halls of men, where the weak huddled against the coming winter, they spoke of the Thunderer's final stand. In the ruins of Asgard, where the few remaining gods licked their wounds, they told of how he had felled the world serpent even as death took him. His hammer, though silent, was not lost. The tides carried it ashore, where it lay gleaming amidst the bones of the fallen, its runes still pulsing faintly with the echo of its master's power. The sea could not claim it. Time could not dull it. It waited, as it always had, for a hand worthy of its weight. And in the east, where the new sun rose over a broken world, a shadow stirred. A child, born under a sky still scarred by lightning, reached for a wooden toy carved in the shape of a hammer. His fingers closed around it, and for the briefest moment, the air hummed with something old, something fierce. Far away, in the roots of Yggdrasil, where the Norns wove the threads of fate anew, a single thread glowed gold. The storm would return. And when it did, the sky would tremble once more.